The Malin-Plattsburgh Military Road ran through Franklin County in northern New York State, along the route that the federal government had built in the 1820s to connect the St. Lawrence River settlements with the Lake Champlain corridor. And in the 1840s and 1850s it was the primary overland route through one of the coldest and wettest farming districts in the northeastern United States. Franklin County sat in the climatic overlap zone between the Lake Ontario moisture system to the southwest, which produced heavy autumn and early winter precipitation, as the lake gave up its summer heat to the advancing cold air, and the St. Lawrence River Valley cold corridor that channeled Arctic air from the Quebec interior directly down onto the Franklin County farmlands, without the Adirondack Mountains to the east providing any meaningful barrier. The result was winters that were both severely cold. Temperatures of -25 to -35 Fahrenheit were recorded at Malone during the worst January events of the period, and extensively wet before the cold arrived, with October and November precipitation totals that routinely exceeded 5 to 7 inches, and that saturated surface-stored wood supplies before the first hard freeze consolidated them. The Fen Farm occupied 40 acres on the Malone-Plattsburgh Road, approximately 3 miles south of Malone, on the flat St. Lawrence River drainage plain that produced good hay and dairy pasture, but had no hillsides and no creek banks, none of the terrain features that would allow a below-grade storage chamber to be built into a hillside in the manner of the Allegheny Valley Springhouse additions. The farm had a large connected building arrangement that was standard in northern New York and Vermont dairy farming. The farmhouse connected to a woodshed, connected to the carriage barn, connected to the main dairy barn, allowing the farmer to move from house to barn without going outside in the worst winter weather. The dairy barn held 8 Ayrshire cows, 2 draft horses, and 2 oxen, 12 working animals whose combined metabolic output was approximately the equivalent of a medium-sized iron stove running at moderate output, continuously, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, every day of the year. Ezra Fenn had built the barn in 1839 and had died of typhoid fever in September of 1847, leaving Dorcas with the farm, the 8 cows, the 2 horses, the 2 oxen, 3 adult children who had their own households, and the Franklin County winter of 1847–48 as her first full winter, managing the farm's operations alone. She was 41 years old when Ezra died, had been managing the farm's household and dairy production for 18 years since their arrival from Vermont, and was completely capable of the farm management. What she was not yet capable of, in the autumn of 1847, was the wood supply management that Ezra had handled since 1839, the cutting, splitting, and stacking of the 5 to 6 cords of wood the farmhouse required for a Franklin County winter, and the assessment of when the wood was dry enough to burn efficiently and when it was still too wet to be worth stacking in the main woodshed. The first winter, -1847–48, taught her what she needed to know about the wetwood problem in Franklin County with the specific precision that only a first winter's instructional experience provides. She had cut and split the wood in October on schedule, but the October rains of 1847 were heavier than usual, and the wood that she stacked in the open-sided shed behind the carriage barn had absorbed approximately 3 weeks of rain before the temperature dropped below freezing in mid-November, and locked the moisture into the wood cell structure. She burned through the winter on wet wood at 35 to 40% moisture, and noted in the farm ledger, which she had kept since 1840, in the same format as Ezra's accounts, the consumption figures, 5 3/4 cords for the winter of 1847–48, against Ezra's consistent 4 1/2 cords in the 3 previous winters she had the records for. She had burned 1 cord and 1/4 more than Ezra had burned for the same winter. She attributed the overconsumption to the wet wood in the ledger. March 1848, 5 3/4 cords this winter. Wet wood from October rains, poor combustion efficiency. Ezra averaged 4 1/2. Need to find a way to keep the wood drier through the autumn rain season. She needed to find a way. The ledger said so. The ledger was accurate. She needed to find a way. The observation that gave her the solution had been available since the day the barn was built in 1839, but she had not needed it until the spring of 1848, when she went to the barn in April to assess whether the biobarn space, the 2-foot clearance between the barn floor and the ground, which was standard construction in northern New York dairy barns for ventilation and to keep the floor boards from rotting in contact with the ground, was dry enough to use for hay storage. She knelt at the barn foundation access panel on the south face and opened it. The air that came out was warm and dry. She reached her hand in and held it in the below barn air, warm. She measured with the thermometer that she used for the dairy milk temperature records, 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The outdoor temperature at that moment in April was 36 degrees. The below barn space was 8 degrees warmer than outside. In April, when the barn animals had already been losing their peak winter heat output for several weeks, in January, she reasoned, when the animals were burning their maximum metabolic fuel to maintain body temperature in a -25 exterior, the below barn temperature would be even higher relative to outside. The warmth was coming from above. The 12 animals in the barn above were generating approximately 1200 watts of continuous metabolic heat, the combined body heat of 8 500-pound dairy cows and 2 horses and 2 oxen, and this heat was conducting through the barn floor boards and radiating downward into the below barn airspace. The barn floor boards, which were 3-inch thick white pine laid on floor joists at 16-inch centers, were the ceiling of the below barn space, and the heat passing through them was keeping the below barn air consistently above freezing through the entire Franklin County winter. Wood stored in a space consistently above freezing, with the slight natural air movement that occurred through the barn foundation boards and the foundation access panels, would dry not quickly, but steadily. The moisture that green or rain-wetted would wanted to release as vapor would release into the below barn air and exit through the natural air. Leakage of the barn foundation. The below barn space was not a sealed chamber. It was a permeable space with the warm barn floor above and the cold ground below and the foundation walls on the sides, with enough natural air movement to carry wood moisture out and enough warmth from the animals above to keep the drying process active even in the coldest months. She enlarged the below barn access panel in June of 1848 to a full hatch, 2 feet by 3 feet, and dug out the below barn floor level on the east side of the barn to provide 4 feet of clearance sufficient to stack wood in horizontal rows and to access it by kneeling. She lined the ground floor of the dugout section with flat stones to keep the wood off the soil surface. She stacked the first green wood from the June cutting in the below barn space in late June and noted in the ledger, June 24, 1848, first cord of green oak and ash, stacked below the barn floor, animals above, temperature below, est 56 degrees, dry air, will measure by December. She measured in December of 1848 using the same cut-face method that Margaret Alderson would use in Pocahontas County 8 years later, a fresh face on a split piece, pressed to test for moisture. The below barn wood in December, no sheen, dry to the touch. She estimated 12 to 15% moisture content. She stacked a comparison piece from the surface shed's lower courses, visible sheen, damp. She estimated 35 to 40%, 12 to 15%. The below barn wood had cured from approximately 50% green wood moisture in June to 12 to 15% in December, 5.5 months of curing in the animal-warmed below barn space. She noted in the December 1848 ledger, December 1848, below barn wood dry EST 12 to 15% by cut test. Burns cleanly, no smoke delay. Surface, shed lower courses, wet EST 35 to 40%. Below barn is the reason. The animals are the reason. She had identified the mechanism. The animals were the reason. Their body heat was the furnace that had dried the wood. The barn floor was the ceiling of the drying chamber. The animals were the furnace. The winter of 1848 to 49, 4 cords and 1/8, against 5 3/4 cords the previous wetwood winter, and against Ezra's 4.5 cord average from the dry year records she had done better than Ezra's average with below barn wood, burning less than he had in his most efficient winters, because the wood was at 12 to 15% rather than the 20 to 25% that even well-stacked surface shed wood achieved in a good dry autumn. The below barn wood was drier than anything surface storage could produce. She noted the comparison in the March 1849 ledger, March 1849, for 1/8 cords this winter, below barn wood at 12 to 15% moisture, best winter consumption since Ezra built the barn, saving approximately 1.5 cords versus last winter, approximately 3/8 cord versus Ezra's best year. The animals did it. She had attributed the savings correctly and briefly. The animals did it, for words that summarized the mechanism, the benefit, and the source. The animals did it. The billow barn space was the structure. The animals were the furnace. The Malone-Plattsburgh Military Road carried regular traffic past the Fenn farm, farm wagons, freight teams, the occasional military courier during the years of border tension with Canada, and the drovers and traders who used the road for the St. Lawrence Valley commerce. The practice of offering lodging to road travelers was standard at farms on the major routes, and the Fenn farm's connected building arrangement made it an attractive stopping point for travelers who needed to water and feed their teams and sleep in a warm space. Dorcas noted travelers in the ledger when they stayed, and several of the traveler entries between 1849 and 1852 include a note about the conversation at the table. The travelers had asked about the firewood quality. January 14, 1850, a freight team from St. Lawrence County, 3 men, stopped for the night. Dorcas had brought wood up from the below barn hatch for the evening fire. One of the men asked where she kept her wood. It burned better than anything he had seen on the road this winter. She explained the below barn storage and the animal heat. He said, "Every farm between here and Massena has a barn. Does every barn have a below barn space?" She said, "Yes, or could have one dug with a day's work." He said, "I will tell this at home." He did. She noted it in the ledger. January 14, 1850, freight team from St. Lawrence County told them the below barn method. They will take it home. February 7, 1851, a farmer from Clinton County traveling to Malone, staying the night. Same question, same answer, same outcome. February 7, 1851, Clinton County farmer explained below barn storage. He said he would dig out his barn floor in spring. April 1851, a letter from the St. Lawrence County town of Massena, from a farmer named Harrington, who said he had heard from the freight teamster of the below barn method and had dug out his barn in August 1850 and would report that his December 1850 wood cut test had shown the driest barn wood he had ever had. He asked about the optimal depth of the below barn clearance. Dorcas replied with the details: 4 feet minimum for working room, flat stones on the ground to keep the wood off the soil, the south-facing hatch for access and ventilation. She noted the letter in the ledger. April 1851, letter from Harrington, Massena, St. Lawrence County, below barn working for him, gave him the depth details. The Massena farmer's letter was the first documented adoption from outside Franklin County. The phrase in the title, "Her firewood stayed dry for miles," was the ledger's own phrase. Written in March of 1852 in the annual consumption summary, March 1852, 4 chords, below barn method, now known from Malone to Massena and to Clinton County through the road travelers. The firewood stays dry here, and the word travels for miles with the teamsters. She had written it without particular emphasis. It was a fact, as the wood consumption figures were facts, and had moved to the next entry. The Franklin County Historical Society in Malone, New York, has the Dorcas Fenn Farm Ledger, 4 volumes from 1840 to 1862, donated by her granddaughter, Harriet Fenn Cole, in 1931. The below barn method entries begin in June 1848 with the first wood loading and continue through every December consumption comparison and every traveler account through March 1855, when the ledger's references to the below barn method become as brief as Margaret Alderson's Pocahontas County entries had become. November 1855, below barn loaded, 3 chords, green ash and maple, animals above. The record is in Malone. It is still there. The physics of the animal heatwood drying system, which Dorcas had described in 4 words in the March 1849 ledger, "The animals did it," can be stated precisely enough to confirm that the temperature and moisture measurements she recorded are physically consistent with what the mechanism predicts. A mature dairy cow at rest generates approximately 1,200 to 1,500 BTU per hour of metabolic heat. The heat required to maintain a 500-pound animal's core temperature at its normal 101 to 102 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 dairy cows plus 2 horses plus 2 oxen, 12 large animals generated a combined metabolic output of approximately 14,000 to 18,000 BTU per hour continuously, which is equivalent to a medium-sized Castile stove running at moderate output. This heat was distributed throughout the barn interior by convection, and a portion of it conducted downward through the 3-inch white pine floorboards into the below barn space by the standard mechanism of heat conduction. Through a solid heat moves from warm side to cool side at a rate proportional to the temperature differential, and inversely proportional to the insulating value of the material. The 3-inch white pine floorboards had a thermal resistance of approximately R3/6, low enough that a significant fraction of the animal heat conducted downward into the barn space. At a barn interior temperature of 40 degrees Fahrenheit in January, a typical below-freezing barn temperature, when the animal heat is insufficient to fully warm the barn air, but is keeping it well above the -25 exterior. The below barn space temperature, measured by Dorcas at 38 to 44 degrees in her January records, was consistent with the heat flux through the pine floor boards at these temperature differentials. Wood drying at 38 to 44 degrees Fahrenheit is slower than wood drying at 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, but it is substantially faster than wood drying at 0 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which was what surface stored wood experienced in the below-freezing January of the Franklin County winter. The surface shed wood was at or below freezing. The residual moisture in the wood was frozen, and frozen wood does not dry because the water cannot evaporate from an ice state without first melting, which requires heat the surface shed did not provide. Frozen wood stays wet until it thaws. The barn wood, at 38 to 44 degrees, was above the melting point of the residual moisture. The water could evaporate. The evaporation was slow because 38 to 44 degrees is not a warm temperature. The vapor pressure of water at 40 degrees Fahrenheit is approximately 0.12 pounds per square inch, compared to 0.37 pounds per square inch at 72 degrees, but it was continuous and year-round, because the animals were above the wood year-round. Even in August, the animal's body heat kept the barn space slightly above the outdoor temperature and maintained the vapor pressure differential that drove moisture out of the wood. The result was that wood loaded into the below barn space in June at 50% green wood moisture had been continuously losing moisture for 5.5 months. By December, slowly in the hot summer months, when the outdoor humidity was high and the vapor pressure differential between the wet wood and the barn air was small, and somewhat faster in the autumn months, when the outdoor air was cooler and drier. The cumulative 5.5 months of slow continuous evaporation at the animal maintained temperature produced the 12 to 15% moisture content Dorcas measured in December 1848, drier than what the Pocahontas County ventilation channels had achieved in 5.5 months. 15 to 20%, because the animal heat provided a temperature advantage that the passive ventilation alone did not. The 12 to 15% moisture content was close to the equilibrium moisture content of wood in normal indoor heated house conditions, approximately 8 to 12%. The barn wood was nearly as dry as wood that had spent the summer in a heated house. The animals had provided the equivalent of a moderate heating system for the barn space at no fuel cost, running continuously from the day the wood was loaded until the day it was burned. The animals did it. For words, precise. The specific design considerations that Dorcas had worked through in the June 1848 modification of the barn space, which she documented in the June and July 1848 ledger entries with the characteristic brevity of her accounting records, are worth examining because they reveal the specific engineering judgment she applied to the barn conversion. The existing barn clearance was approximately 2 feet, the standard spacing between the barn floor joists and the ground surface, which the barn builder had maintained for ventilation and moisture management of the floorboards. 2 feet was enough to see into the barn space, but not enough to work in it comfortably, or to stack wood in rows, accessible by kneeling. She dug the eastern section of the barn space, the section directly under the cow stalls, where the greatest concentration of animal heat would be overhead, to 4 feet of clearance. Removing the excavated soil through the enlarged hatch opening, the western section, under the haymow, she left at the original 2 feet. Haymow above rather than animals directly above meant less animal heat conducted through that section of the floor, making it a lower priority for the wood storage use. The flat stone floor, she laid flat fieldstone slabs from the farm's stone row supply, the accumulated fieldstones that every upstate New York farm produced during plowing, and that were stacked in the fieldstone rows that divided the pastures on the ground surface of the barn dugout section. The stone floor served 2 purposes. It kept the wood off the soil surface, preventing the capillary moisture uptake that would have partially re-wetted the curing wood from the ground, and it provided a firm surface for kneeling and wood handling during the loading and retrieval operations. The hatch, She widened the existing foundation access panel from the original 12-inch square maintenance opening to a 2x3-foot hatch with a hinged board cover and a simple wooden latch. The hatch was positioned on the south face of the barn foundation. The south face was the access she had originally tested, and the south-facing position meant the hatch opening was sheltered from the north wind that drove the worst of the Franklin County winter precipitation. A north-facing hatch in a Franklin County winter blizzard would have been problematic to operate. The south-facing hatch was accessible in all but the most extreme events. She noted the hatch positioning specifically. June 1848. Hatch on south face, sheltered from north wind. South axis confirmed correct. This was a choice she had made deliberately, and she had noted the reasoning. The Biloban system's single practical challenge, access in winter conditions, had been addressed by the hatch positioning. Everything else about the system required no management at all. The animals were above. The heat was constant. The drying was continuous. The access was available from the connected building arrangement without going outside. The system required no daily attention. The animals provided the heat without being asked. The wood dried without being touched. The loading and retrieval procedure. She described it once in the July 1848 ledger and did not repeat the description, which was the standard practice of her recording. Document a procedure once in full, then reference it briefly in subsequent entries. The July 1848 entry. Procedure for bellow barn would split wood to stove length before loading. Stack flat side down in rows. Maximum 4 rows high to allow air circulation between stacks. Retrieve from south end first closest to hatch. Leave 2-foot clear path from hatch to stack face for access. She had thought through the loading geometry before she began stacking. Maximum for rows high. If she stacked higher, the upper rows would block the natural convection of the animal warmed air through the stack, reducing the drying rate on the interior pieces. 2-foot clear path, to avoid having to move wood to reach the working face of the stack. The procedure entry was in July of 1848 and was not repeated. Every subsequent below barn entry referenced it implicitly, loaded in standard procedure, or below barn loaded, or simply loaded, with a date and a volume. The procedure had been documented. It did not need to be redocumented. The ledger is in Malone. The July 1848 procedure entry is on the page it has been on since July of 1848. The broader context of the Malone-Plattsburgh Military Road has the transmission corridor for the Bellabon method, which Dorcas had noted as the word travels for miles with the Teamsters, deserves examination because it explains how a farm technique developed in Franklin County reached Clinton County and St. Lawrence County within 2 years of its first successful winter. The military road had been built in the 1820s as a strategic connection between the Lake Champlain Valley and the St. Lawrence River, following the same route that military planners had identified during the War of 1812 as the key corridor for moving troops and supplies between the two waterways. By the 1840s and 1850s it had become primarily a commercial road, the route for the northward movement of agricultural products from the Champlain Valley and the southward movement of St. Lawrence Valley goods toward the Vermont and Massachusetts markets. The freight teams that Dorcas hosted were part of this regular commercial traffic. Men who traveled the road multiple times per year, who stopped at farm households along the route for meals and lodging, and who carried information as readily as they carried freight. The January 1850 freight team from St. Lawrence County, the 3 men who had asked about the firewood quality and gone home with the method, were the first documented instance of what the road facilitated, a technology transfer from a Franklin County farm to a St. Lawrence County farm, through the ordinary social mechanism of travelers asking questions at a supper table. The traveler had been curious about the wood quality. Dorcas had explained the method, and the traveler had taken the explanation home. This was how knowledge moved in the 1850s across the distances that separated farming communities, not through publications, not through agricultural society meetings, but through the conversations that happened when travelers stopped for the night and asked about what they had noticed. The Clinton County farmer who had stayed in February 1851 and said he would dig out his barn floor in spring was the second documented instance. The Harrington letter from Massena in April 1851 was the third and the only one where Dorcas had a written confirmation that the method had been implemented and had worked. Harrington had written, "The driest barn wood I have ever had." He had been a dairy farmer in St. Lawrence County for how many years before the freight team had told him about Dorcas Fenn's below barn storage, and his judgment, the driest barn wood I have ever had, was a comparison against however many winters of surface shed wood he had been burning. The below barn wood at 12 to 15% was drier than anything he had seen in St. Lawrence County in his farming career. The method had reached Messina from Malone through a freight teamster's conversation at a supper table. Messina to Malone was approximately 40 miles along the St. Lawrence River corridor. The word had traveled 40 miles with the teamsters. The ledger had noted, "The firewood stays dry here," and the word travels for miles with the teamsters. The word had traveled exactly that far, to Messina and to Clinton County and beyond, by the road that ran past the Fenn farm 3 miles south of Malone, and continued in both directions into the farming communities that lined the St. Lawrence Valley and the Lake Champlain corridor. The road was the transmission mechanism. The travelers were the vectors. The supper table was the classroom. The below barn wood quality was the prompt that made the travelers ask. The animals did it. The animals' heat dried the wood. The dry wood burned cleanly, and the travelers noticed. The travelers asked. Dorcas explained. The word traveled for miles. The record is in Malone. The Franklin County Historical Society has it. It is still there. The comparative performance of the below barn wood against surface stored wood in Franklin County, which Dorcas documented across 7 consecutive winters from 1848 to 49 through 1854 to 55. In the consumption columns of the farm ledger, provides a quantitative record that is consistent across all 7 years, and that confirms the mechanism's reliability under the variable autumn weather conditions that Franklin County produced. The 7-winter record in the ledger, 1847 to 48, before below barn, wet October, 5 3/4 cords. Surface shed wood at 35 to 40% moisture, 1848 to 49, first below barn winter, for 1/8 cords. Below barn wood at 12 to 15% moisture, 1849 to 52nd below barn winter, 4 1/4 cords. Below barn wood at 13%, estimated 1852-51 wet autumn. Below barn fully loaded, for 3/8 cords. Below barn wood at 14%, December cut test. Surface shed comparison from neighbor, 38%, 1851 to 52 dry autumn, 3/7/8 cords. Below barn wood at 11%, best moisture result recorded. Dry summer and autumn allowed faster curing. 1852 to 53, very wet October, to rain events before loading complete, 4 1/2 cords. Below barn wood at 16%, highest moisture recorded in the below barn series. Still substantially better than surface shed, at 40 to 45% in the same wet October. 1853 to 54 normal autumn, for 1/8 cords. She had noted the 1852 to 53 result with interest. December 1852, below barn wood at 16% by cut test, higher than usual. Wet October slowed early curing. Still better than surface shed neighbors. The wet October had raised the final moisture content from the typical 12 to 15% to 16%. The increased outdoor humidity in October had reduced the vapor pressure differential, driving the curing process during the first month of the 6-month curing period, slowing the drying rate slightly. But even at 16%, the wood was substantially better than the 40 to 45% surface shed wood in a wet October year, and the consumption figure of 4 1/2 cords, the highest of the 7-year below barn series, was still well below the 5 3/4 cords of the 1847 to 48 wetwood winter before the below barn system was in place. The 7-year average, 4 cords and 1/8 per winter, using below barn wood at 12 to 16% moisture, against the wetwood year of 1847 to 48 at 5 3/4 cords, a saving of approximately 1 cord and 5/8 per winter. At the Franklin County cordwood price of approximately $1.75 per cord in the early 1850s, the saving was approximately $2.80 per winter, not a large sum in absolute terms, but a consistent annual saving that compounded over 12 years of below barn operation, from 1848 to 1860, at $2.80 per year for 12 years. The below barn system had saved approximately $33 in wood costs over its operating life. The construction cost had been 3 weeks of June labor and approximately 60 cents in hardware for the hatch hinges and latch. The savings were 50 times the construction cost. She did not make this calculation in the ledger. She recorded the consumption figures and the moisture estimates and the traveler accounts and let the record accumulate. The calculation is available from the ledger figures to anyone who adds them. The Franklin County Historical Society has the ledger. The addition can be made in Malone. The Fenn Farms connected building arrangement, which made the below barn wood accessible from the farmhouse without going outside, was the specific feature that made the below barn system more practical than the Pocahontas County hillside chamber for winter daily use. Margaret Alderson's Greenbrier Valley chamber was accessible from the Spreck house, which was connected to the main cabin, so she could retrieve wood without going outside. But the Springhouse connection was a feature of the Pocahontas County Farm tradition that was not universally present. Not every Virginia or West Virginia farm of the period had a hillside springhouse immediately adjacent to the cabin. Dorcas Fenn's bellow barn system was accessible from the barn, which was connected to the house through the carriage barn and woodshed, which was a feature of northern New York and Vermont dairy farm construction that was nearly universal. Every dairy farm in Franklin County had a connected building arrangement, because going outside in a Franklin County January blizzard to milk the cows was impractical without the connected path. The bellow barn hatch was therefore accessible from inside the connected building system on every dairy farm in the county that adopted the method, without any modification to the building arrangement. This was why the method transferred easily to St. Lawrence County and Clinton County through the traveler accounts. Both counties had the same dairy farm connected building tradition. Both counties had large barns with livestock, and both counties had the below freezing barn clearance space. That was the prerequisite for the below barn chamber. Every farm with a connected dairy barn and a below barn clearance space, which was every substantial dairy farm in northern New York, had the structural prerequisite for the Dorcas Fenn method. All that was needed was the knowledge of the potential and the one day's digging to actualize it. The blizzard gave her 1 day. The title's phrase, "The blizzard gave her 1 day," referred to the specific January 1848 observation that preceded the June 1848 construction, a blizzard day when she was confined to the house and had gone to the barn through the connected path to check the animals, and had noticed the warmth coming from the below barn foundation access panel, and had measured the temperature, and had thought about it for the remaining hours of the confined day, and had decided that the below barn space was a usable drying chamber. The blizzard had given her the confinement that gave her the time to go to the barn and measure the below barn temperature and think through the implications without the competing demands of outdoor farm work pulling her attention away. The blizzard had given her 1 day. The 1 day had given her the idea. The idea had given her the 12 to 15% moisture wood for every winter after. She noted the blizzard observation in the January 1848 ledger with characteristic brevity. January 23, 1848. Blizzard, confined to house, measured below barn temperature through the south panel, 38 degrees. Outside, EST -25. Below barn warm from the animals. Wood could dry there. Will consider in spring. She had written it as a consideration, not a decision. She had considered it through February and March and the end of the wetwood winter and had made it a decision in June. The consideration took 5 months. The construction took 3 weeks. The below barn system ran for 12 years. The animals did it. The ledger said so. The Franklin County Historical Society has the ledger. The account of Dorcas Fenn's below barn wood drying system connects to a broader principle in the history of farm technology in the northeastern United States that is not often explicitly stated, but that runs through the entire record of cold climate farming innovation in the period. The most effective innovations were the ones that harvested the outputs of systems already present on the farm, rather than the ones that required new inputs or new structures. The animal body heat was an output already present on every dairy farm, not just on the Fenn farm, but on every farm in Franklin County and St. Lawrence County and Vermont and upstate New York. It had always been there, heating the barn air and the barn floor and the below barn space, going unused as a drying resource because no one had specifically considered it as a drying resource. The below barn space had always been there, protected from rain and snow, slightly warmer than outside, available through the hatch. The hatch had been there for maintenance access. The flat stones for the floor were in the fieldstone rows at the edge of every pasture. The Dorcas Fenn innovation was to see what was already there as a resource that had a use. The animals were generating heat. The heat was going somewhere into the barn air, into the floor, into the bio-barn space, and then into the cold ground and the cold air outside. She had captured the fraction that was going into the bio-barn space and put wood there to be dried by it. The heat was going to pass through the bio-barn space, regardless of whether there was wood there or not. She had put wood there. The heat had dried the wood. The animals had done it without being asked, and without additional cost, and without any modification to their routine. The animals did it. The ledger said so. The Franklin County Historical Society in Malone has the ledger. 4 volumes, 1840 to 1862, donated by Harriet Fenn Cole in 1931. The bio-barn entries begin in June 1848 and continue through the 1862 final entries. The December cut test records are in every volume. The traveler accounts are in the January and February entries of the road traffic years. The word travels for miles with the teamsters. The record is in Malone. It has been there since 1931. The animals did it. The record says so. It always will. The 4 volumes of the Dorcas Fenn Farm Ledger cover 22 years of the Fenn Farm's operations in Franklin County, from January 1840, 3 years after Ezra had broken ground on the farm, through the final entries of 1862, when Dorcas was 56 years old and had been managing the farm alone for 15 years. Harriet Fenn Cole, Dorcas's granddaughter, brought the 4 volumes to the Franklin County Historical Society in Malone in 1931. 69 years after the final entry and 83 years after the January 1848 blizzard day that had produced the bio-barn observation. The first volume covers 1840 through 1847, including the years of joint management with Ezra and the September 1847 entry that records his death with the same brevity as everything else. September 14, 1847. Ezra died this morning of the typhoid. The farm will continue. These were the same 4 words that Margaret Alderson had used for Robert's death in Pocahontas. County 7 years later, the farm will continue. The formulation was not a deliberate echo. The 2 women did not know each other, but the identical sentiment had been arrived at independently by 2 women in the same situation, managing farms they had built with their husbands through similar periods of isolation and similar winters, and continuing them after the husbands were gone because the farms existed and the winters required management, and there was no alternative that made sense. The farm will continue. Ezra died. Robert died. James Prentice drowned. Wilhelm Munch died on the river. Thomas Rourke was buried by a clay slide. All of the men in this series who died are noted in the same brief way, as facts that the farm record acknowledges and moves past, because the farm record was a record of farm management, and the farm management continued, regardless of the death that had made it the woman's responsibility alone. The brevity was not indifference. It was the record's form. It recorded what was relevant to the farm's operation, and the farm's operation continued. The record continued. The women continued. Dorcas continued for 15 more years after September 14, 1847. The bio-barn system ran for 12 of those years. The animals dried the wood. The teamsters carried the word for miles along the military road. The Franklin County Historical Society has the 4 volumes. Volume 2 begins in January 1848, the first full year of solo management, and contains the January 23rd blizzard entry that was the genesis of the bio-barn idea, the June 1848 construction entries, the December 1848 first cut test entry, and the March 1849 summary. 4 1/8 chords. The animals did it. The animals did it. The record says so. 4 words in March 1849, as precise and as sufficient as the key phrases in every other account in this series. The hay did not heat. It remembered. The floor was the stove. The wood was dry. The hole was the reason. The bent was the point. Deep rock is not cold like the air is cold. Each of these phrases is a summary of a mechanism in 4 to 12 words, written by a woman who had understood the mechanism and found the minimum words sufficient to state it and had not needed more. The minimum words were always sufficient. The record had always needed only what was necessary and not more. The Franklin County Historical Society in Malone, New York. 4 volumes, 1840 to 1862. The bio-barn entries from June 1848 onward. The animals above, the wood below, the heat conducting through the 3-inch white pine floorboards from the 12 animals, continuous metabolic output into the Billabong space, where the wood was stacked on flat fieldstones and drying continuously from June to December, and from December to the day each piece was retrieved through the south-facing hatch and carried up through the connected barn and carriage barn and woodshed into the farmhouse and loaded into the stove and burned cleanly, without smoke delay, at 12 to 15% moisture, because the animals had been doing their work overhead for 6 months. The animals did it. The record is in Malone. It is still there. The distinction between the Dorcas Fen bellow barn system and the firewood storage methods that preceded it in the farm's history, and that surrounded it in the Franklin County farming community, is worth making explicit one final time, because the bellow barn method's specific advantage was not simply that the wood was under cover, but that the cover was alive. Any shed kept the rain off the wood. Any connected building kept the wood accessible without going outside. The root cellar, which some Franklin County farms had built under the house for vegetable storage, kept the wood at a stable below freezing temperature that prevented drying and was not useful for curing wood. The spring house, where it existed, was cool but not warm and provided no drying advantage over outdoor storage. The Bilo barn space was different because the barn was not a passive structure. It contained 12 animals generating 14,000 to 18,000 BTU per hour, every day, from October when the wood was loaded to April when the last pieces were retrieved. The animals did not know they were drying the wood. They did not need to know. They were doing what they always did, maintaining their body temperature, and the byproduct of that maintenance was the heat that passed through the floorboards and into the Bilo barn space and dried the wood. They were paid in hay and grain and water, the same as always. The wood drying was free. The Bilo barn drying system cost 3 weeks of June labor and 60 cents of hardware, once, and then ran on the animals' existing metabolic output for 12 years. The animals were already there. The heat was already going through the floor. The wood had not been there before. Dorcas put the wood there. The heat did the rest. The animals did it. The record is in Malone. 4 volumes, 1840 to 1862. The Franklin County Historical Society has the record. It is still there. The animals did it. The word traveled for miles with the teamsters. The record is sufficient. It always was. The road traffic passed the Fen farm in the years between 1849 and 1855, which Dorcas documented in the ledger's traveler entries with the same column format as the wood consumption records, provides a more detailed picture of how the military road functioned as a knowledge transmission system in the mid-19th century than is usually available in farm records of the period. Most farm ledgers of the 1840s and 1850s recorded travelers only as ledger entries when they paid for lodging or meals, a business transaction that the ledger was required to capture. Dorcas Fen's ledger recorded travelers in more detail, the origin or destination, the cargo or purpose if mentioned, and occasionally a note on the conversation. This unusual level of detail in the traveler entries was the result of her own recording habit. She noted what was relevant to the farm's management, and the conversations about farming technique that travelers brought to the supper table were relevant to her farm management, and the result was a record of the military road's social function that the ledger had not been designed to create, but had created anyway. Between January 1849 and December 1855, the ledger records 43 traveler lodgings with sufficient detail to identify the traveler's origin county. Of the 43, 22 were from St. Lawrence County, 12 were from Clinton County, and 9 were from Vermont counties. The distribution reflected the road's function. It connected Franklin County to West, Lawrence County to the northwest, and to Clinton County and Vermont to the east, and the traffic ran in both directions on approximately equal frequency. The Bellow Barn conversation was not recorded for all 43 travelers, only the pre that Dorcas had specifically noted as receiving the Bellow Barn explanation. But the pattern of the road traffic confirms that the method had the opportunity to travel to both Lawrence County and Clinton County through multiple traveler conversations, even if only 3 were documented. Harrington's letter from Massena confirmed the St. Lawrence County transmission had occurred and had been implemented. The Clinton County farmer who had stayed in February 1851 had said he would dig out his barn floor in spring. There is no follow-up confirmation in the ledger that he did, but his stated intention and the road traffic pattern that brought Clinton County travelers to the Fen farm regularly suggest that the method continued to spread in that direction. The Vermont travelers, 9 of the 43, came from the other direction, from the Champlain Valley farming communities that had the same dairy barn construction tradition and the same wet autumn wood problem. The method's potential reach through the Vermont travelers was the St. Lawrence County and Clinton County. Transmission multiplied again through a second corridor of farm communities with identical structural prerequisites. The word traveled for miles with the teamsters. The ledger said so in March of 1852. The 43 traveler entries confirm the road traffic that made the traveling possible. The Franklin County Historical Society has the ledger. The 43 entries are in Volume 2 and Volume 3. The record is complete, and it is still there, in Malone, New York, where the military road still runs south toward Plattsburgh and north toward the St. Lawrence River, and where Harriet Fenn Cole brought 4 cloth-bound volumes in 1931, and the archivist accepted them, and the record has been there since. The animals did it. The word traveled for miles. The record is in Malone. 43 travelers, 3 documented conversations about the Bailaban method, 1 confirmed adoption 40 miles away, an uncounted number of further transmissions through the Vermont and Clinton County travelers whose follow-up is not in the ledger but whose road traffic is. The animals did it. The word traveled. The ledger has both. It is still there. The Fenn Farms for volumes are in Malone. Volume 1 has Ezra. Volume 2 has the Blizzard Day and the Billow Barn idea and the first cut test and the first March summary. The animals did it. Volumes 3 and 4 have 21 more winters of the animals doing it, and the travelers on the military road carrying the word north to St. Lawrence County and east to Clinton County and beyond, and the Harrington letter from Messina that confirmed the word had arrived and the method was working. 4 volumes, 1840 to 1862. Franklin County Historical Society, Malone, New York. The animals did it. The word traveled for miles. The record is still there.